In the midst of World War II, Britain experienced one of the strangest trials in its history. It wasn't about spies, war crimes, or treason, but witchcraft. In 1944, Helen Duncan, a Scottish spiritual medium, was put on trial under an old, nearly forgotten Witchcraft Act. But what led to this dramatic turn of events? And why was the British government so concerned about her séances? Today on Night Coffee Crime, we uncover the bizarre and mysterious case of Helen Duncan, the last person convicted under Britain's Witchcraft Act. Helen Duncan was born in Callander, Scotland, in 1897. From an early age, Helen seemed destined for a life out of the ordinary. Her family were devout Christians, but Helen herself claimed to have a special gift, a connection to the spirit world. As she grew older, Helen began to hone her abilities, conducting séances where she claimed to physically manifest spirits. She wasn't just your typical medium. Her séances were dramatic, with spirits allegedly materializing from ectoplasm, a ghostly substance she would produce from her own body. Spiritualism was incredibly popular in the early 20th century. After the devastating losses of World War I, and then the growing toll of World War II, people were desperate to connect with their lost loved ones. Helen's services became highly sought after. To many, she was the real deal, a woman with genuine powers, who could offer comfort to the grieving. In 1941, during the height of World War II, Helen Duncan held a séance in Portsmouth that would change the course of her life. In the darkened room, she reportedly summoned the spirit of a sailor. But this wasn't just any sailor, he belonged to the HMS Barham, a British warship that had recently sunk after being torpedoed by a German U-boat. The problem? The sinking of HMS Barham was classified information, known only to top military officials and a few of the families of the victims. The British government had kept the sinking a secret to maintain public morale and prevent the enemy from learning of the loss. Witnesses at the séance were stunned when the sailor allegedly revealed details of the ship's fate. How did she know? Was Helen truly speaking to the dead? Or had she somehow learned top-secret military information? The authorities took notice, and Helen Duncan suddenly found herself under intense scrutiny. But Helen's troubles didn't start with the infamous 1944 trial. Helen Duncan was first arrested in 1933 in Edinburgh, Scotland. During a séance, she allegedly produced fake ectoplasm, which was later found to be made of cheesecloth. Investigators accused her of fraud, and she was charged under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which was often used against mediums and fortune-tellers. She was fined £10, a substantial amount at the time. But it was not enough to keep her from continuing her séances. And soon, she would face a much larger and more dramatic legal battle. By 1944, Britain was entrenched in war, and national security was a priority. In January of that year, police raided one of Helen Duncan's séances in Nottingham, and she was arrested once again. But this time, instead of being charged with a simple crime like fraud or vagrancy, she was charged under the Witchcraft Act of 1735, an ancient law meant to punish those claiming to use witchcraft to deceive. The Witchcraft Act had been largely dormant for centuries, but Helen's case was seen as so serious that the authorities wanted to make an example of her. The trial was sensational, with supporters claiming Helen was a genuine medium, while skeptics believed she was a fraud taking advantage of grieving families. The prosecution argued that Helen's séances were not just fraudulent but dangerous, especially during wartime. One of the most surprising figures to get involved in Helen Duncan's case was none other than Prime Minister Winston Churchill. As the trial gained national attention, Churchill expressed his outrage, not necessarily because he believed in Helen Duncan's spiritual powers, but because he found the entire affair absurd, especially during a time of war. Churchill wrote a letter to the Home Secretary, branding the trial as obsolete tomfoolery. He criticized the government for wasting resources on prosecuting someone under a centuries-old law, when the country was in the midst of fighting a war. He even questioned why such an archaic act like the Witchcraft Act was being used at all in the 20th century. While Churchill's intervention didn't stop the trial, his comments reflected a growing public sentiment that the case was a distraction from the far more pressing issues of the time. His involvement has since added another layer of intrigue to the case, raising questions about whether Helen Duncan's prosecution was politically motivated or simply a sign of wartime paranoia. Helen Duncan's trial wasn't just one of the last prosecutions. Under the Witchcraft Act, it was the final major case. The trial exposed just how outdated the law was. And in 1951, 7 years after Duncan's conviction, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was repealed. It was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which was specifically designed to address false claims made by spiritualists and mediums, without invoking archaic notions of witchcraft. Under the new law, the focus shifted from accusations of witchcraft to regulating fraudulent activities. The repeal of the Witchcraft Act marked the end of a bizarre chapter in British legal history. The new law, the Fraudulent Mediums Act, was aimed at preventing exploitation, while acknowledging that people had the right to believe in spiritualism if they chose to. Helen Duncan's trial is often seen as the final spark that led to this change. During the trial, witnesses claimed that Helen Duncan had faked her séances by using cheesecloth and other materials to simulate ectoplasm. The police even raided one of her sessions, searching her for concealed items. Despite the defense's argument that Helen's powers were genuine, the jury found her guilty of pretending to summon spirits. She was sentenced to 9 months in Holloway Prison. Her conviction sparked outrage among spiritualists and even members of the public, who believed she had been unfairly targeted. Many questioned whether she was being punished for her supposed psychic powers, or for potentially revealing military secrets. After serving her sentence, Helen Duncan was released, but never truly recovered from the scandal. She continued her work as a medium, but remained under constant suspicion. She passed away in 1956, but her legacy didn't end there. In the decades since, her supporters have campaigned to clear her name, arguing that she was the victim of wartime paranoia, and that her trial was a miscarriage of justice. Helen Duncan's story remains a fascinating intersection of spiritualism, war, and fear. Her trial was a strange throwback to a darker time in British history, when belief in witches and the supernatural collided with the reality of global conflict. Even Winston Churchill saw the absurdity of it all. Was Helen Duncan truly in contact with the dead? Or was she simply caught up in the turmoil of war? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories from Night Coffee Crime. Thanks for watching.